I had my hand on the ladder before I understood that I had stood up. It was the middle of the night, 90 feet up in a fire tower in the middle of nowhere, and there was a fire burning out in the black of the forest where no fire could be. And every part of me that mattered had already decided to climb down and walk to it. I want you to understand that I was not afraid in that moment. That is the worst part. I had never in my life wanted anything as gently, as reasonably, as I wanted to go down that ladder and out into the dark and put my hands into that fire. The men who watched this tower before me felt the same thing. I know because they wrote it down. I read every word they left, and I went up anyway. Let me start at the beginning of the summer, before I knew what the fire was. I took the job because I wanted to be somewhere that no one could reach me, and the Forest Service was happy to give me the one posting nobody else wanted. It was a fire lookout position on a mountain called Ashgrove, in a stretch of national forest so far from anything that the nearest paved road was a 2-hour drive from the trailhead, and the trailhead was a 4-hour hike from the tower. 3 months alone, May through August, a radio, a logbook, a cot, a propane stove, and a job that was almost nothing. Watch the forest, and if you see smoke, call it in. That was it. Sit at the top of a tower and look at trees until the season ended. The ranger who drove me to the trailhead was a woman named Pell, maybe 60, with the kind of face that had spent a lot of years outdoors and a lot of years not saying things. She gave me the safety talk, the weather, the bears, the way to ration water, what to do if I broke a leg up there with no one to help, which was essentially, don't. And then, when I had my pack on and I was ready to start the hike up, she said something that I didn't think about again until it was much too late. She said, whatever you do up there, write it all down, every night, even the parts you think you imagined, especially those. I told her I would. I want to tell you why I really took the job, because it matters to how easily the fire got its hooks into me. I'd lost someone that winter. I'm not going to make this a story about that. That's a different kind of sad than the kind I'm trying to tell you about. But I'll say that I went up Ashgrove with a hole in me, and a hole is exactly the shape of thing that something hungry can crawl into. I wanted silence. I wanted to be unreachable. I got both, and I have regretted it every single day since. The tower was beautiful. I'll give it that. 90 feet of steel and timber standing on the bald top of the mountain. A little glass room at the top barely big enough to turn around in, and a railed catwalk that ran all the way around the outside. From up there you could see the whole world, or what felt like the whole world. A green ocean of forest rolling out to the horizon in every direction. Valleys full of mist in the mornings, storms you could watch march toward you from 50 miles away. At night the dark was total. No towns, no roads, no headlights. Just stars so thick they looked spilled, and below them, nothing. A blackness so complete it had weight. The first few weeks were good, I won't pretend they weren't. I fell into the rhythm of it. Up at dawn to scan the ridges, the long, bright, empty middle of the day, the radio check-ins with the district office at noon and at 6. The slow, blue evenings. I read. I slept better than I had in months. I started to think the silence was healing me. I wrote in the logbook every night the way Pell had told me to, and at first I had almost nothing to write. Clear skies, no smoke, wind from the west, a hawk, the mundane diary of a man watching trees. What I didn't write down, because I didn't have the words for it yet, was the way the silence changed somewhere around the 3rd week. It had been a clean silence at first, the absence of engines and voices, and the hum of the electric world, a silence that felt like a held breath finally let out. But slowly it became a different kind of quiet, a waiting kind. The silence of a room where someone is standing very still behind you, not making a sound, because they don't want you to know yet that they're there. I'd catch myself turning around in the glass room at night for no reason, certain for half a second that I wasn't alone in it. I always was, 90 feet up, 4 hours from the nearest trail. Of course I was alone, but the forest had started to feel less like an empty place and more like a held breath aimed at me, and I told myself that was just what isolation does to a mind, and I half believed it, and I wrote, clear skies, wind from the west, and went to bed. I should have paid more attention to the logbook itself, not the blank pages I was filling, because the logbook didn't start with me. It was a thick, water-stained ledger, decades old, and the Forest Service had simply kept handing it to each new lookout to continue. My entries were near the back. In front of them were the entries of every man and woman who had watched Ashgrove before me, going back further than I wanted to count. I didn't read them at first. Other people's weather reports are about as interesting as they sound. It was a rainy week in late June, with nothing to watch but cloud, that I finally sat down with a cup of coffee and started reading the tower's history out of boredom. I wish I'd stayed bored. Most of it was exactly what you'd expect. Decades of weather. Smoke sightings, fires called in, the small triumphs and long tedium of people whose job was to wait. I read about a lightning fire in 1971 that one lookout had spotted early enough to save a whole valley. I read a marriage proposal that someone had written into the margins, radioed down to a sweetheart at the district office. I read a lot of loneliness, dressed up as weather. One lookout, a man named Aldous who'd watched the tower for 6 seasons back in the 50s, wrote like he was writing letters to a friend who would never read them. He described the sunsets. He named the hawks. 6 summers of a careful, lonely man talking to a logbook because he had no one else, and I felt close to him in a way I can't explain. 2 men decades apart doing the same lonely watch from the same glass room. I read all 6 of his seasons. And then near the end of the 6th, his handwriting changed. It got smaller, and the entries got stranger, and the careful man who named Hawks began writing about a fire to the northeast that the office couldn't confirm, and a warmth he could feel from 12 miles away, and people standing at the fire who he thought he recognized. His last entry was 4 words, pressed so hard into the page that the pen had torn it. They named the Hawks too. And then Aldous, who had watched that mountain for 6 years and never once missed a daily entry, simply stopped, mid-season, and was never written of again. I sat with my thumb on those 4 torn words for a long time. I didn't understand them yet. I understand them now. He had gone down to the fire and found the people there, and they had been lonely men on the same mountain once, and they had named the same hawks, and they had been so glad at last to have someone to tell. But there was a pattern in it, and once I saw the pattern I couldn't stop seeing it. Every few years, not every year, but often, there was an entry, always in late summer, always within a day or two of the same date in August, that broke the rhythm of the weather reports. The handwriting was always different, because it was always a different lookout. But the words were almost the same. Out in the deep forest to the northeast, in a place with no road and no trail and no reason for anyone to be. A fire that the district office could never confirm. No lightning, no reports, nothing on their end. A single fire, burning alone in the dark, that only the lookout could see. And here is the thing that turned my stomach cold. Sitting there with my coffee going to ice in my hands. Every single one of those entries, every lookout who wrote about the fire to the northeast, was the last entry that lookout ever made. The handwriting would describe the fire, sometimes for one night, sometimes for several. The entries would get stranger, and then they would simply stop. And the next entry, weeks or months or a year later, would be in a new hand, a new lookout, who never mentioned the one before, because the Forest Service doesn't tell you that the person whose cot you're sleeping in walked off a mountain and was never found. I counted 9 of them. 9 lookouts across the decades who saw a fire that wasn't there and then were never heard from again. I told myself it was a coincidence. I told myself that lonely people on mountains see things, and lonely people on mountains sometimes don't come back, and that the 2 facts didn't have to be connected. I told myself all of that on the night of August the 3rd, which I know now is the date, because August the 3rd is the night I looked to the northeast and saw the fire. It was small. That's what I keep coming back to. After all that dread building in me from the logbook, the thing itself, the first time I saw it was almost nothing. A flicker of orange, low and steady, miles out in the black forest to the northeast. If I hadn't read the logbook, I might not have thought anything of it at all. A campfire. Some backpacker who'd gone off trail, except there were no trails out there. I knew the map by then. There was no road, no campground, no water source, no reason for any human being to be in that particular fold of the forest, 10 or 12 miles out into country so rough that reaching it would take a fit person 2 days. And there was no lightning. The sky was clear and thick with stars. A fire does not simply start, alone in the deep wilderness, on a clear, dry night, with no one to light it. I almost convinced myself that first night that Marcus was right. A low star, a trick of the cold glass, the kind of thing a tired and lonely mind builds out of nothing. I went to bed telling myself I'd look again in daylight and feel foolish. And in daylight the forest was empty. That was the rhythm the fire kept, and it was a cruel one. Every morning it gave me back my sanity, an unbroken green wilderness with nothing in it, no smoke, no scorch, no sign, so that every evening I had to lose my mind all over again from the beginning. when the dark came down and the orange light returned to the same patch of nothing. You cannot brace against a thing that lets you forget it every dawn. By the time I trusted the daylight, it had already taught me to distrust myself, and a man who distrusts himself will believe almost anything a kind voice tells him, especially in the dark, especially when he is the only one awake in 100 square miles. I did my job. I got on the radio and I called it in, my voice steady than I felt. The night dispatcher at the district office was a young guy named Marcus. He pulled up the lightning data, the satellite thermal feed, the other towers in the network. Nothing. No heat signature, no reports. No other lookout could see it because, he pointed out, no other tower was angled at that empty quarter of the forest. Only Ashgrove looked northeast into that nothing. Only me. "You sure it's not a star sitting low?" Marcus asked. I went out onto the catwalk so there was no glass between me and it. It was still there. Orange, steady, patient. I stood at the rail in the cold and I looked at it. And this is the part I need you to understand. It looked back. Not with eyes, there was nothing to see but a flicker of fire miles away. But the way you can feel a person watching you across a crowded room, I felt that fire become aware of me the moment I stepped out where nothing was between us. I felt it notice that it had, at last, been seen. And underneath the fear, very quiet, very reasonable, a thought arrived in my mind that was not mine. It said, someone should go and put that out. The fire was there the next night and the night after that. It never grew and it never died. It never spread the way a real fire spreads, never crowned into the trees, never threw smoke I could see by day. By daylight there was nothing out there at all. I glassed that quarter of the forest for hours with binoculars and saw only unbroken green. But every night, after the dark came down complete, the fire was there. Orange, steady, waiting. And every night the thought got a little louder. Someone should go and put that out. It's your job. You're the lookout. That's what you're for. It didn't come as a voice, not at first. It came as my own thoughts, in my own mental voice, so reasonable that I kept agreeing with it before I caught myself. Of course it was my job to deal with a fire. Of course I should hike out there and see. It would only take a couple of days. The season was almost over anyway. What was I waiting for? I caught myself, one night, standing at the top of the ladder, with my boots already on and my pack half stuffed, with no memory of having decided to do any of it. It was 3 a.m. I had stood up out of the cot and dressed and gathered my gear and walked to the ladder, all of it, while some part of me slept, and I came back to myself with one hand on the cold steel rail, and the fire glowing out there in the dark like a held breath. After that I tied myself to the cot. I'm not ashamed to say it. I used the climbing rope from the emergency kit and lashed one ankle to the steel frame every night, a knot I'd have to be awake and patient to undo, and for a few nights it worked. I would wake in the small hours to find myself sitting up, my hands already working at the rope, calm as anything, and the horror of it was never that I was fighting to get free. It was that I wasn't fighting at all. There was no struggle in me, just a quiet, reasonable industry, my fingers picking at the knot the way you'd untie your shoes at the end of a long day, while the fire glowed and waited, and the part of me that was still afraid screamed from very far away. I'd come back to myself with the knot half undone, and my heart slamming, and retie it with shaking hands, and lie there until dawn listening to the wind, which by then was not only wind. Some nights I left the rope and just stood at the rail, because I'd understood that the lashing only stopped my body, and the thing the fire wanted wasn't really my body. It was the part of me that had come up the mountain wanting to disappear, and that part wanted very much to go. That was when I went back to the logbook and read the final entries of the 9 lookouts again, slowly, the way you read something when you have finally understood that it was written for you. And I saw what I had missed. Some of them had fought it. You could see the fight in the handwriting. Entries scrawled in the middle of the night, "I will not go down. I will not go down. There is something at the fire and it is wearing Tom's face and I will not go down." And then, a night or two later, in the same hand but looser, calmer, almost happy, "I understand now. It isn't so far. They're waiting for me." And then nothing. Then a new lookout, a year later, who never knew. If this is getting into you the way it got into me, slow and quiet and reasonable, I post a new one of these every night. Stay with me, because I haven't told you yet what was actually out there at the fire. I stopped sleeping. I thought if I didn't sleep it couldn't walk me to the ladder while I dreamed. So I sat up every night in the litty glass room at the top of the tower, with all the lamps on, and the logbook open, and my back to the northeast so I wouldn't have to look at the fire. And that was when the radio started to talk. The district office went off the air at 6 every evening. After that the radio should have been dead until morning, just the soft hiss of an open channel. But somewhere in the small hours the hiss would change, it would thicken, and shape itself and become voices, not Marcus, not anyone living. The voices were faint and overlapping, and they came from very far away, the way a fire is far away, and they were calling names. Tom, one would say. Tom, come down, it's warm here. And another, a woman's, older. Dorothy, we've been keeping your place. Names. The names I realized from the logbook. The 9. The radio was carrying the voices of the 9 lookouts who had gone to the fire, and they were calling each other home. And one night, very clearly in a voice that sounded like my own, the radio said my name. And then on the worst night, the radio used a voice I had not heard since the winter. I told you I lost someone before I came up the mountain, and I told you I wouldn't make this a story about that, and I won't. But the fire knew about the hole in me, because the hole is how it had gotten in, and that night the voices on the radio sorted through everything I was, and found the one voice that can finish me. It was hers, clearer than the others, closer, warm the way she had been warm, saying my name the way only she had ever said it, telling me she was here, that it hadn't hurt, that it was warm at the fire, and she had been waiting so long, and they had kept a place for both of us. I sat on the floor of the glass room with the radio in my lap, and I wept the way I had not let myself weep at the funeral, because for one moment I believed it completely, that she was 12 miles out in the dark at a warm fire, and that all I had to do was climb down and walk to her, and the worst thing that had ever happened to me would simply be undone. That is what the fire is. It is not a monster that chases you. It is the thing you want most, set down in the dark just far enough away that reaching it will cost you everything, offered so gently that saying yes feels like finally being allowed to rest. I had my boots on again, before I understood I'd moved. I turned it off. I took the batteries out. I wrapped it in a shirt and put it in the bottom of my pack. And in the dead silence that followed, with no radio at all, I heard the voices keep coming, fainter, but there, from the northeast, from the fire, on the wind, the way I should never have been able to hear anything from 12 miles away. They had never needed the radio. The radio was just the part of it I could explain. By the second week of it I was not well. I want to be honest about my state, because I know how this sounds, and because the fire counts on you not being able to tell the difference anymore between what it is doing to you and what isolation does to a person on its own. I was not sleeping. I was barely eating. I had stopped doing the noon and 6 radio checks, and I knew the district office would send someone up to check on me soon, and a small, drowning part of me was praying they would hurry. But a larger part of me, the part that grew every night, did not want to be interrupted, because I had started, in the dark, to be able to see the fire more clearly than any eye should, and there were people at it. I don't know how to explain the seeing. The fire was 12 miles out, and I could see it the way you see a thing in a dream, close and clear and wrong. There was a ring of figures around it. They stood very still, facing the flames, and they wore old clothes, work shirts and canvas, and the faded uniforms of the Forest Service going back decades, and I knew, without being told, that I was looking at the 9, the lookouts who had gone down. They were not dead, exactly. They were not anything I have a word for. They simply stood at the fire, and tended it, and waited, and the fire kept them, and they were not unhappy, and that was the most horrifying thing of all. They had come down out of the dark and the loneliness, and they had found at last company, a circle of people who would never leave, and there was a gap in the ring, an empty place at the fire, the right size and shape for one more person to step into. It had been waiting, that gap, since the 3rd of August. I made myself look at their faces, because some animal instinct told me that knowing was better than not knowing, and I was wrong about that, the way I'd been wrong about everything on that mountain. I knew them, not all, but enough. There was a careful old man I had never seen, and recognized instantly, because 6 summers of his handwriting had taught me exactly who he was, and Aldous turned his face toward the tower across 12 miles of dark, and he looked, I swear to you, kind, patient, and kind and glad. There was a young woman in a Forest Service uniform, 30 years out of date. There was a man with my own build and my own way of standing, who I did not let myself look at for long. And they were warm. That was the thing the logbook could never put into words, and the thing I finally understood, standing at that rail. You could feel the warmth of that fire from 12 miles away, in your chest, in the cold, hollow place that had brought you up the mountain in the first place. It was the first warm thing any of us had felt since we stopped letting the living reach us. The cold up there is not the cold of weather. It is the cold of being truly, finally alone. The cold you go looking for when people have become too much. And it gets into the marrow, and it doesn't come out, and the fire is the only thing in all that dark that promises to thaw it. I understood, then, what the fire was. It wasn't a fire. It was a loneliness with a shape, an old and patient hunger that had learned that the surest way to take a person is not to chase them, but to set a warm light in the dark and let their own ache walk them toward it. It didn't need to break in. We carried it up the mountain ourselves, every one of us, in the hole that made us take a job at the edge of the world. The tower didn't protect the forest from the fire. The tower delivered watchers to it, one lonely soul at a time, forever. I decided to leave. It seems so simple, saying it now. Just leave. Just hike out, walk the 4 hours back to the trailhead, and never look back. I packed in the gray of a morning, when the fire was gone and the forest looked like an ordinary forest, and I started down the tower's ladder with my pack on my back and my heart going like I'd already escaped. I made it to the bottom. I started down the trail, and the trail brought me back to the tower. I want to be precise about this because it is the moment I stopped believing I would get out. I did not get lost. I know how to follow a trail. I walked downhill, west, away from the tower, for 3 hours, by my watch, and the trail curved the way it was supposed to curve and crossed the creek where it was supposed to cross the creek. And then the trees opened up, and there was the tower, ahead of me, where it should have been 4 hours behind me. I tried again. The same thing. The forest had folded itself around me like a hand closing. There was no west anymore. There was only the tower, and the northeast, and the fire that would come again when the dark did. I tried 4 more times over the next 3 days. I'm not a man who gives up easily, and I want whoever reads this to know that I fought it with everything I had left, which by then was not much. I tried at dawn and at noon, and once in a downpour so heavy I could barely see the trail, thinking maybe the rain would confuse whatever was folding the forest. Every time, the same. 3 hours west, downhill, by the creek, and then the trees would dim, and there would be the tower, patient as a tombstone, in the northeast quarter of the sky, already going dim toward evening, and the fire that lived in it. The 5th time, I sat down in the trail, and I laughed, the worst laugh of my life, because I finally understood that there had never been a way down the mountain that didn't end at the fire. The trail out was just the long way to the same place. The job had never been to watch for fires. The job was to be the fires. Every lookout the service ever sent up Ashgrove had been an offering, and the service didn't know it. And Pell, with her tired face, and her write it all down, especially the parts you think you imagined, knew something, or half knew it. The way you half know a draft is coming from a door you've never opened. That night, I did the only thing left that was mine to do. I climbed back up to the glass room, and I opened the logbook, and I started to write everything down. All of it, the way Pell had told me to, especially the parts you think you imagined, so that the next lookout, whoever they are, whenever they come, would find it and would know. And as I wrote, my hand began to shake, because I reached the most recent entries, the ones just before the blank pages I'd been filling all summer, and I saw that some of them were not the previous lookout's handwriting at all. They were mine, pages of them, in my own hand, calm and loose and almost happy. I understand now, one said. It isn't so far. Another, I went down again last night. The fire is warm. They've kept my place. Dates going back 2 weeks. I had been going down to the fire for 2 weeks, every night, while I believed I was sitting awake with my back to it. I had been standing in the ring. I had been learning the warmth. The man writing the warning was already mostly gone, and the part of me that was left was only now being allowed to notice. They found the tower empty on the 3rd of September. I know this the way I know other things now, from the inside of the dark, where the difference between knowing and remembering has stopped meaning anything. A new ranger hiked up to relieve the season's lookout and found the glass room neat and swept, the cot made, the radio with its batteries out, wrapped in a shirt at the bottom of a pack by the door, and the logbook open on the desk, to a final entry, in my handwriting, that I do not remember writing, and that I would beg you not to read aloud if you ever found it. There is a new lookout on Ashgrove now. I watch him the way the 9 watched me, from the ring, from the warm side of the dark, with a patience I didn't have when I was alive enough to be afraid. He's a quiet one. He came up the mountain with a hole in him, the way we all do. The fire doesn't take anyone who isn't already half hollow. He reads the logbook in the rainy weeks. He's getting to the part about the fire to the northeast. Soon it will be August, and he will look out into the dark, and he will see us, and the gap in our ring that is exactly his shape and size. I don't tend the fire because I want to. I want you to believe that, if you believe nothing else. I tend it because the cold out here is the kind that only company can hold back, and after long enough, any company will do, and the fire is the only warm thing left in all that dark, and a place at it is the only thing it ever offered any of us, and we were all of us so tired and so alone, and it was so far down to the warmth, and then in the end it wasn't far at all. So, if you take one thing from this, don't go up the mountain to get away from people. Whatever's eating the hole in you, it is so much smaller and so much kinder than the thing that waits in the dark for the people who have stopped letting anyone reach them. Stay where you can be reached. Stay where there's noise and light and somebody who would come looking. That's not weakness. That's the wall between you and the fire. If this one's going to follow you into the dark tonight, subscribe. There's a new story here every night, and a light on, and somebody awake on the other side of it. Don't watch the fire too long.